bright studio lights glared down on Karoline Leavitt as she walked onto the set of American Perspectives, one of the nation's most watched political talk shows. At 28, Karoline was the youngest press secretary to ever serve a U.S. president, a position that had thrust her into the national spotlight overnight. Across the glossy black table sat Victor Mercer, the show's veteran host, known for his cutting liberal commentary and his ability to reduce even seasoned politicians to stammering messes. "We're live in 3, 2, the floor director's fingers counted down silently. Victor's practiced smile appeared instantaneously as the cameras rolled. "Good evening, America. Tonight, we have with us Karoline Leavitt, the surprisingly young press secretary to President Thompson." Karoline noticed the immediate dig at her age, but maintained her composed smile. This wasn't her first ambush. The research folder her team had compiled on Victor revealed his tactical approach: disarm with condescension, then attack policy positions as naive or dangerous. She had prepared accordingly. "Ms. Leavitt," Victor continued, "some critics suggest your appointment was more about optics than qualifications. How do you respond to allegations that you're simply a youthful face for an aging administration's desperate attempt to connect with younger voters?" Instead of defensive posturing, Karoline leaned forward, her eyes meeting Victor's with unexpected intensity. "I'd say those critics haven't bothered to check my resume, Victor. But I suspect you have, which makes me wonder why you'd open with a question that undermines your own credibility as a journalist." Victor's smile faltered slightly, unprepared for her direct challenge to his professional integrity. Beyond the studio's polished veneer, America was a nation deeply divided. The Thompson administration had won by the narrowest of margins in an election that had left half the country feeling unrepresented. As press secretary, Karoline navigated this fractured landscape daily, her New Hampshire upbringing giving her a unique perspective on the rural-urban divide plaguing American politics. The daughter of a small business owner and a public school teacher, Karoline had worked her way through Boston College, graduating summa cum laude before cutting her teeth in political communications.
She had served as communications director for 3 congressional campaigns before joining President Thompson's team, earning a reputation for straight talk and unflinching defense of conservative principles. Victor Mercer, by contrast, represented the coastal media elite. The son of a prominent newspaper editor, he had attended Columbia Journalism School and spent 20 years building his brand as the voice of progressive America.
His show consistently topped ratings, particularly among urban viewers, and his takedowns of conservative figures often went viral, boosting his profile and his 8-figure salary. Behind the scenes, Victor's producer Diane Chen watched nervously from the control room. She had warned him about underestimating Leavitt, whose rapid rise suggested a political acumen beyond her years. "She's not the typical administration mouthpiece," Diane had cautioned during pre-show prep. "She comes with receipts." Now, as Karoline confidently countered Victor's opening salvo, Diane's concern deepened. The show's social media feeds were already lighting up, viewers surprised and impressed by the young press secretary's refusal to be intimidated. "Let's talk policy then," Victor pivoted, shuffling his note cards. "Your administration's stance on climate regulations has been criticized as dangerously regressive. How do you justify prioritizing corporate interests over the future of our planet?" "I appreciate your concern for the environment, Victor," Karoline replied, her voice measured but firm. "But that framing presents a false choice between economic prosperity and environmental stewardship. The Thompson administration has invested more in clean energy innovation than any previous government. What we oppose are ineffective regulations that outsource American jobs and emissions to countries with even weaker environmental standards." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The interview wasn't following his usual script. Typically, his guests would become defensive, allowing him to interrupt and reframe their responses. Karoline, however, answered concisely and preemptively addressed his likely follow-ups. "Innovation alone won't save us," Victor pressed. "Experts universally agree that without immediate regulatory action, we face catastrophic consequences. Is your administration willing to take responsibility for that legacy?" "Which experts specifically?" Karoline countered. "Because Dr. James Wilson from MIT, who served under the previous administration, published research last month supporting our balanced approach. I'd be happy to send you the study after our interview." Victor hadn't read the study. His research team had missed it in their briefing. He glanced down at his notes, buying seconds to regroup. Sensing his hesitation, Karoline continued, "The American people deserve nuanced discussion of complex issues, not alarmist sound bites. I think voters are smarter than that, don't you?" The question was a trap, and Victor knew it. Agree, and he'd be admitting his approach was simplistic. Disagree, and he'd be insulting his audience. In the control room, Diane whispered into Victor's earpiece, "Move to immigration. We have stronger material there." Victor nodded slightly and shifted tactics. "Let's discuss the border crisis. Your administration's policies have been described as inhumane by humanitarian organizations. How do you reconcile that with your claims of compassionate conservatism?" For the first time, a flash of genuine anger crossed Karoline's face. "I visited the border facilities last month, Victor. Where compassion is truly lacking is in policies that encourage dangerous border crossings led by human traffickers. What we're doing is creating lawful pathways while enforcing sovereignty, something the previous administration failed to do, despite controlling both houses of Congress for 2 years. This time, Victor was ready. Yet reports of family separations continue. Those reports, Karoline interrupted firmly, refer to cases where DNA testing revealed adults were not related to the children they traveled with. Would you prefer we release children to potential traffickers? In the green room, watching the broadcast on a monitor, sat Jackson Reed, a veteran political operative who had mentored Karoline early in her career. He smiled as he watched his protege skillfully deflect Victor's attacks. What the audience didn't know, what even Karoline didn't know, was that Jackson had been approached by opposition operatives with damaging information about her family. Her father's business had allegedly employed undocumented workers during a period of expansion 10 years ago. The opposition planned to leak this information next week, hoping to paint Karoline as a hypocrite on immigration policy. Jackson had come to warn her after the show, torn between loyalty to his protege and his obligation to the party. Meanwhile, among the production staff, a young assistant named Marcus Ellis was surreptitiously recording the interview on his personal device. As a supporter of Karoline's straightforward approach to politics, he had grown increasingly disillusioned with Victor's theatrical ambushes that prioritized ratings over substance. On social media, clips of Karoline's responses were already going viral. The hashtag Charles Leavitt Lectures was trending nationally, with viewers from across the political spectrum expressing surprise at her composure and command of facts. "We need to wrap this up," Diane instructed Victor through his earpiece. "Pivot to the closing question." Victor nodded again. "One final question, Ms. Leavitt. Your administration has repeatedly questioned the integrity of our democratic institutions, from courts to election systems. Isn't this dangerous rhetoric that undermines public trust?" Karoline paused, weighing her words carefully. This was the question she had anticipated, the one designed to provoke a soundbite that could be weaponized against the administration. "Victor," she began, "questioning is not undermining. It's the foundation of a healthy democracy. When Americans across the political spectrum express concerns about any institution, the answer isn't to silence them, but to strengthen transparency and accountability. The real danger comes from telling citizens they shouldn't ask questions about systems that govern their lives." As Karoline finished her answer, a production assistant rushed into the control room, whispering urgently to Diane. Victor's smug expression froze as Diane's voice came through his earpiece. "Breaking news. The Wilson study she mentioned was just verified by 3 other research teams. It's hitting the wires now." The timing couldn't have been worse for Victor. He had planned to circle back and challenge Karoline's citation, suggesting it was cherry-picked or misrepresented. Now, live on air, he was faced with news that validated her earlier point. What the production team didn't realize was that Karoline had orchestrated this moment. The research had indeed been completed, but her team had coordinated with the scientists to announce their verification during her interview window, anticipating Victor's likely dismissal of the initial study. "Before we conclude," Victor said, attempting to maintain control, "I'm receiving word that the climate research you mentioned has received additional scientific support. Would you care to comment?" Karoline's smile was genuine now. "I believe that speaks for itself, Victor. When we base policy on evidence rather than ideology, we often find common ground. That's what the Thompson administration strives for. Solutions that work for all Americans, not just those who share our political views. The camera caught Victor's momentary loss for words, a rare sight for his regular viewers. In that pause, the power dynamic of the interview visibly shifted. "And we're clear," called the floor director as the show cut to commercial. Victor immediately removed his microphone, avoiding eye contact with Karoline. "Good segment," he said curtly before exiting to his private office. In the control room, Diane was already fielding calls from network executives. The interview was generating unprecedented social media engagement, with clips spreading across platforms faster than their own social media team could track. While liberal viewers expressed shock at Victor's uncharacteristic stumbling, conservative audiences celebrated what they saw as a long-overdue challenge to mainstream media bias. Karoline remained seated, checking her phone as messages flooded in. A text from President Thompson himself. Masterfully handled. "Cabinet room, 9 a.m. tomorrow." What neither Karoline nor the show's producers realized was that among the millions watching was Supreme Court Justice Eleanor Winters, who had been considering retirement. Justice Winters, though appointed by a Democratic president, had grown increasingly concerned about the polarized discourse surrounding the judiciary. Watching Karoline's measured defense of institutional questioning while still expressing respect for democratic norms had given the justice pause. Perhaps there were still thoughtful voices emerging in American politics. Jackson approached Karoline as she exited the studio. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "There's something coming you need to prepare for." The studio audience, initially stacked with Victor's supporters, buzzed with conflicted impressions. "She's not what I expected," admitted one viewer to another. "I still disagree with her policies, but she made some valid points." In the week that followed, the interview continued to reverberate through American politics. Victor's ratings dipped slightly, while requests for Karoline to appear on other networks skyrocketed. The Thompson administration seized the momentum, launching a series of town halls where cabinet members engaged directly with citizens across the political spectrum. When the story about Karoline's father finally broke, she faced it head-on. Rather than denying the allegations, she held a press conference alongside her father. 10 years ago, my father's construction business hired workers through a subcontractor who provided what appeared to be valid documentation, she explained to the assembled press. When questions arose about some workers' status, my father immediately implemented stricter verification protocols and self-reported to authorities. This experience shaped my understanding of how complicated our immigration system can be for small business owners trying to follow the law. Instead of the scandal her opponents had hoped for, Karoline's transparent approach earned her respect from unexpected quarters. Immigration reform advocates reached out to discuss how her family's experience could inform more practical policies. Meanwhile, Victor Mercer faced a professional crisis. Network executives, noting the public response to Karoline's appearance, pushed him to evolve his interview style to include more substantive debate and less gotcha journalism. Initially resistant, Victor finally agreed to a meeting with Diane to discuss the show's future direction. "Viewers are changing," Diane explained, showing him the analytics. "They're tired of the same partisan performances. What Leavitt brought was authenticity. She didn't just recite talking points. People responded to that. Across demographics." Victor sat silently, contemplating how a segment he'd intended to be a routine takedown had instead become a catalyst for his own professional reevaluation. 6 months later, American politics faced a new crisis. A controversial Supreme Court ruling had inflamed tensions across the country. Protests erupted in major cities, and public trust in institutions reached new lows. President Thompson called an emergency cabinet meeting. "We need someone who can communicate our position while acknowledging legitimate concerns from both sides," the president told his assembled team. "Karoline, I want you to give the administration's official response." This would be Karoline's most significant challenge yet, addressing a divided nation on an issue where middle ground seemed impossible. As she prepared her remarks, she received an unexpected call. "Ms. Leavitt, this is Victor Mercer." Karoline paused, surprised. They hadn't spoken since the interview. "I'm hosting a special town hall on the court's decision tomorrow," Victor explained. "Both sides, equal representation, honest dialogue, no gotcha questions, no edited clips. Would you represent the administration's perspective?" The invitation represented everything Karoline had advocated for, substantive discussion across political divides. But it also posed tremendous risk. The administration's legal team advised against it, arguing that unscripted exchanges could be weaponized. Jackson advised caution. Victor may have evolved, but he still has a brand to maintain. This could be an elaborate trap. As Karoline weighed the decision, Justice Winters announced her retirement, creating a vacancy that would further intensify the national conversation about the judiciary's role. President Thompson hinted that he wanted a nominee who could bridge divides rather than deepen them. With stakes impossibly high, Karoline made her decision. She would participate in Victor's town hall, but on one condition. The event would be live-streamed unedited on all platforms, preventing selective editing afterwards. The town hall atmosphere crackled with tension. Victor had assembled a diverse audience representing the full political spectrum. As promised, he opened with a commitment to substantive dialogue. "Tonight is about understanding perspectives different from our own," he began. "No one will change America by shouting down those they disagree with." When Karoline took the stage, the audience response was mixed. Applause mingled with visible skepticism. Victor's first question cut to the heart of the controversy. "The administration has expressed measured support for the court's decision while acknowledging concerns about its implications. Isn't this trying to have it both ways?" Karoline took a deep breath. "It would certainly be easier politically to either fully embrace or completely reject the ruling. But leadership isn't about easy choices. It's about honest ones. This ruling has complex implications that reasonable Americans can and do disagree about. Our position acknowledges that complexity." A woman in the audience stood up. "My family will be directly harmed by this decision. How can you ask for civility when people's lives are affected?" "I would never ask you to be civil about injustice," Karoline responded. "Passion and even anger have their place in democracy. What I'm suggesting is that we can channel those emotions into productive dialogue that leads to sustainable solutions rather than temporary victories." As the town hall progressed, something remarkable happened. Victor, instead of looking for moments to undermine Karoline, began facilitating genuine exchanges between audience members with opposing views. The conversation evolved from accusation to substantive policy discussion. In the control room, network executives watched in astonishment as viewership numbers climbed. Audiences weren't tuning out of the nuanced discussion. They were sharing it, commenting on it, engaging with it. As the town hall concluded, Victor extended his hand to Karoline. "Thank you for taking a chance on this format. I think we've demonstrated that Americans are capable of more than soundbite politics." Karoline shook his hand firmly. "Perhaps we've both underestimated what viewers really want." In the aftermath, political commentators struggled to categorize what they had witnessed. Was it a détente between warring political factions? A cynical rebranding exercise for both participants? Or something more fundamental, the first signs of an evolution in American political discourse? President Thompson called Karoline the next morning. "The response has been overwhelming. We're seeing support from unusual allies on our judicial nominee shortlist." What no one anticipated was Justice Winters' public statement, released that afternoon. Last night's town hall demonstrated that thoughtful dialogue across differences remains possible in American politics. This gives me hope for the future of our democratic institutions. 1 year later, Karoline Leavitt stood in the White House press room for her final briefing as press secretary. She had accepted a position as the host of a new political dialogue program, co-hosted with Victor Mercer. Their unlikely partnership had emerged from the realization that they shared a fundamental belief in the intelligence of the American people and their capacity for nuanced understanding. Their show, Common Ground, had already demonstrated promising ratings by featuring respectful but challenging conversations across political divides. As she prepared to take questions one last time, Karoline reflected on how her confrontation with Victor had transformed both their careers. What had begun as an attempt to discredit her had instead revealed an appetite for substance over spectacle in American political media. "No matter our political differences," she told the assembled press corps, "we share a responsibility to elevate our national conversation. Complex problems demand thoughtful dialogue, not just clever sound bites." Across town, Victor watched the briefing on his office television, preparing notes for their first episode together, an examination of how media incentives shape political discourse. The show's early promotions featured the now famous clip of their first contentious interview, followed by footage from the town hall that had changed their trajectories. They had not resolved their political differences, but in a fractured media landscape, they had discovered something more valuable: the possibility that opposing viewpoints, presented with respect and substantiated with facts, could coexist not just peacefully, but productively. What does today's political dialogue look like in your experience? Have you witnessed moments where respectful disagreement led to better understanding, or even unexpected alliances? We'd love to hear your stories of conversations that bridged divides rather than widened them. Share your experiences in the comments below and join the discussion about how we can elevate political discourse in our own communities. Remember, change doesn't always come from those in power. Sometimes it starts with how we choose to engage with those we disagree with. Subscribe for more stories that challenge our assumptions and inspire thoughtful conversation.